In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Thomas Cowan, who is a veteran in the alternative medicine arena. Today, we talk about viruses and exosomes, the role that electricity plays in health and disease, a specific form of water that may decrease your risk of cancers, and a deep dive into the roots of all disease. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our show and our final episode on our series, Science, Mysticism, and Beyond, Humanity's Next Phase of Evolution. So today we get to talk to Dr. Thomas Cowan, and I'm excited to get into that with you in just a moment here. But I first want to bring up something that I've had many people talking to me about and asking me about the last while, and that is aging, and particularly anti-aging, or how I like to describe it is the way Dr. Todd Ovokadis calls it, is aging younger. So how do we actually set the stage for aging younger? In my experience, there's three essential things that we need to talk about when we are trying to mitigate the effects of aging, or at least slow it down and not be so affected by the natural process of aging, which sometimes is not actually quite so natural. So, three big things. Number one, reducing free radical damage. And I'm going to go through each one of these things in more detail. Number two is increasing adult stem cell production. And number three is minimizing or extending the length of telomeres. And so one thing that's really important is that all three of these areas are supported by using the powerful antioxidant C60 by Purple Power. And I'm going to go through each one of these things as far as how they affect aging. So number one, reduce free radical damage inside the cell. Why is this so important? So when we are able to reduce free radical load inside the cell, we basically start to increase our efficiency and production of mitochondria. So when we can increase mitochondrial function and produce energy more efficiently, then we start to see lowering of some of the side effects of aging. So some of the things that you're going to see, some of the appearance things are going to be like less wrinkles, less UV damage from the sun, less premature graying, right? Those are all some of the appearance things that most of us like to see when we try to reduce the effects of aging. But some of the other things that can happen, and these are some of the things reported by C60 users, are things like increase in energy and increases in mental clarity, and even an increase in sex drive. Now, that's probably due to the fact that C60 use can increase pregnenolone, which is kind of known as the ringleader hormone that is the precursor to all of our other youth restoring hormones. So lowering free radical load, definitely important one when you're trying to reduce the effects of aging. So it takes us to number two. Stem cells, so increased stem cell production. So what's a stem cell? So some people are probably aware of it. Stem cells have been a big business for quite some time now, where people are getting stem cell injections into painful joints and different areas of their body. They're putting them in their hair to try to increase hair growth. We can use them for lots of different things. Stem cells are essentially the body's raw material. They are the cells from which all other cells with specialized functions generate from. So when we have more stem cells, we can essentially improve many areas of our body and decrease the breakdown. So things like speeding up wound healing, we can repair blood vessels, we can create new bone cells and new muscle cells, all of these types of things when we can increase the stem cells. And there was one study in 2012, an animal study, where the animals receiving C60 lived 90% longer than those that did not. So outside of just improving aging, we can actually live longer. Okay, which takes us to our third one, which is telomere length. Now, that's been a big measure for a long time. This is one of the main measures used for biological age, and it's probably one of the biggest predictors of overall life and health span. And so a telomere, essentially, we think of it like a shoelace. So it's like the plastic cap on the end of your shoelace. So that plastic cap is what keeps the shoelace intact. And when that plastic cap starts to get smaller and smaller and breaks apart, then you start to see fraying at the end of the lace. So the telomeres are essentially the cap on the end of the DNA. And so as cells replicate over and over again, every time they replicate, the cap gets a little smaller. And eventually when the cap starts to get really small, and then we start to see the fraying of the DNA. And that's essentially when we see the signs of aging. So again, like wrinkles and graying of the hair and maybe aches and pains and inflammation of the joints and some of these different things that tend to happen. Okay. And so What's also been shown is that C60 has been shown to extend the length of DNA telomeres. And some C60 users have had their telomeres tested, and they actually been shown to have telomere length of someone that's much younger than their current biological age. So I've been taking C60 for a little while now, and I'm looking at all the different benefits that are happening for me. So I take it orally, and all that's required is 1 teaspoon a day to add to your regular routine. And that's enough of this incredibly powerful antioxidant to start to have some of these different anti-aging effects. Now I take it orally, take about 1 teaspoon a day, and I also put a little bit on my actual skin sort of in the evening before bed, just as a topical on the skin. So check it out. If you haven't had a chance to yet, click the link below. Use the coupon code Dr. Loken. That's capital D, capital R, capital Loken, all in capitals. And click the link and you'll get 15% off the individual bottles and 20% off subscriptions. Now, as we move on to our final episode here with Dr. Cowan, I've been excited to talk to Dr. Cowan for a while now. I mean, he's a veteran in this field, in this industry, and he's done so much. He's written several different books, all really, really mind-blowing and incredibly important to look at in the world of alternative medicine. So we look at a lot of different stuff, and I'm looking to have Dr. Cowan on the show again because he has such a breadth of knowledge that I want to keep tapping into and learning more from. So some of the big things we talk about today are we look at things around viruses and exosomes. We talk about water and particularly this fourth phase of water. There is a book written on that by Dr. Pollack, and Dr. Cowan and I go deeper into this and explain what this means and how you can actually access that water yourself and what that means and how that affects the cell itself. So we're going to get into more details around that, which is really important. We look at a deep dive into the root causes of illness. We look at how fear affects exosomes and affects our health. And we look at some of the big stuff around electricity and how that functions with our body, how that can either set the stage for health or how it can actually set the stage for disease. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and then stay tuned as we will also have Dr. Cowan, I believe, on a live event with us coming up shortly, I think on the 1st. And just check the website and check the, particularly check our social media on Facebook and YouTube. That's where, and Instagram. That's where we will have the links for the live events. And Dr. Cowan may be joining us with one of the group events as well coming up on the 2nd, possibly too. So we'll put those all in the social media platform. So stay tuned to watch that because that information is generally just on the YouTube channel under Dr. Jason Loken, ND. It is not through the podcast platform. So check that out to make sure that you get the additional information. All right, everybody, enjoy the episode, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health podcast. And as we finish up with our final episode on the Science, Mysticism, and Beyond, Humanity's Next Phase of Evolution series. And today's guest is Dr. Thomas Cowan. Dr. Cowan is a well-known alternative medicine doctor, author, and speaker with a common sense, holistic approach to health and wellness. He's given countless lectures and workshops throughout the US on a variety of subjects in health and medicine, and is the author of 6 books. Recent publications include The Contagion Myth, co-authored with Sally Fallon Morrill, Cancer and the New Biology of Water, and Human Heart, Cosmic Heart. Until his recent retirement from active practice, Dr. Cowan had a general medicine practice, first in upstate New York, then for 17 years in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and for 17 years in San Francisco. He was a founding board member of the Weston A. Price Foundation and currently serves as its vice president. Dr. Cowan continues to actively lecture and interview, sharing information via his website, drtomcowan.com, where he also offers many of the products he has used personally and in his practice. Additionally, Dr. Cowan offers high-quality, beyond organic vegetable powders and kitchen staples on his drcowansgarden.com website. Dr. Cowan lives with his wife, Linda, on a rural farmland in upstate New York. He has 3 children, 1 stepson, and 6 thriving grandchildren. Dr. Cowan, what an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I was looking forward to chatting with you. I've gone through many of your books and I feel like we could have this conversation for hours and hours, but we're trying to condense some of the big picture stuff as much as we can today. Maybe we can pick up on other parts down the road here at some point. Maybe for listeners that aren't as familiar with you, right off the bat here, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of your experience that brought you to really embrace this broader, more holistic perspective of health?
I had a sort of normal growing up. I mostly wanted to play basketball and golf, and was actually pretty good at both of those. Uh, uh, I also like to read like Russian novels in the dark. My sister used to call me the underground man. Um, and I sort of just, I grew up with a lot of doctor friends of my parents, and I had the sense that they didn't know much. Even though some of them were actually quite famous. The guy who invented the laser for gynecology was a good friend of my family. What I discovered about them is that they cared more about winning the golf tournament than they did about their practice. And interestingly, I was better at golf than they were. So that made me think I didn't have to be intimidated by them. I went to college at Duke. I didn't like it very much and decided I wanted to do anything but be a doctor. So I joined the Peace Corps to learn gardening and went to Swaziland. And there I was given books by Rudolf Steiner and Weston Price. And I think for me, it was sort of the experience of, I for the first time realized that the type of doctor I didn't want to be was not the only type of doctor there was. And the way of seeing the world that I had been taught, which I always thought was just not right, and I didn't know why, I just didn't like it, was not the only way of seeing the world. And then it was sort of like a switch went off in me, and that's like 40 some years ago. And I would say every day since then, I've tried to figure out what health and medicine and life is all about.
When you were in the Peace Corps, you were, I remember reading in your book that you started to read a lot around Weston Price and Rudolf Steiner's work. What were some of because I remember when I was going through naturopathic medicine back in the day too, Weston Price was one of the books that I had gotten into. And I kind of found like that just started to feel like a holy grail for me as far as wrapping my head around what the big picture of healthcare really was. What were some of the philosophies in that really stood out to you from the work with Weston Price and Rudolf Steiner, particularly?
The main thing is a method. And the method is, which is very much different than the way people do science and medicine now. You would think that the way you would do medicine or science, or if you're talking about like nutrition or food, that it would make sense to ask the question, who were the healthiest people and then what did they eat? I mean, it doesn't sound very complicated, but instead of that, we measure, lipid profiles and biochemical profiles and nutrients, and somehow we expect to piece that together and find out what you should eat, which is, of course, why people are confused. Mm-hmm. So Price just went around the world looking for people with perfect teeth, because it would have been hard to find people with perfect livers, because nobody knows what a perfect liver is. But perfect teeth is easy. No decay, all 32 straight teeth with no disease. He found 14 groups, figured out that they all ate the same food, took pictures, wrote it down, and that's the human diet. It's as simple as that. But the most important thing is the method. And we don't do that anymore. We don't study what actually happens to people. And we make up all this scientific, I would say, nonsense to study it. And we end up just confused and lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what appealed to me so much about it too, is that it just seemed to simplify the whole process and made it very tangible. It was like, here's your outcome, and that's what you're looking for. And it wasn't too hard to kind of figure out how the people arrived at that by just backtracking from that point on what people were eating. And it really did seem so simple to me and profound at the same time. But I do find the same thing, that medicine becomes
let me
really
give you an
complicated.
example. There's a lot of people out there who say humans shouldn't eat milk because it's food for baby cows or goats or whatever. And it's like I tell people, I can tell the story any number of ways. Like I could convince you that humans shouldn't eat milk, or I can convince you they should eat milk. Either one depends which kind of mood I'm in. But the reality is, you can find people who lived long, healthy, disease-free lives, as is the normal for humans. And, 50% of their diet was cultured milk. Now, they didn't drink pasteurized milk from, horribly fed cows. That's, obviously. So there's a quality issue here. And so the people who say things like that obviously have no sense of the reality of human experience, or they wouldn't say that. The same with grains and lots of other things. Fact of the matter is, people ate grains. And the other thing is, there were no vegans in those 14 groups that he studied, because they either no traditional people was sort of dumb enough to do that. And if they tried, they would become infertile. And so they didn't last, because that's what happens. So you can make a theory about it, and it sounds great. And I can make a theory about a lot of things. The reality is nobody did that. And so then you can throw it out. Doesn't work.
I remember I listened to the same Joe Rogan podcast that I think you talked about in one of your books too, on the sort of debate between the paleo and vegan. And I remember thinking the same thing when they kind of hit the one point where it's like, well, prior to this point, nobody really had heart disease. And I was thinking the same thing then. So what did they eat prior to that point? Because that's kind of the good baseline then to
Right.
take a look at.
Before 1920, there was almost no heart disease in this country. And I know the exact number of vegans by choice in 1918. 0 by choice. Some of them may be forced into it, but and so those two things just don't square. But because we don't think like that, one could even argue we don't really think, then we don't see those things. So we have these endless arguments based on, quote, science. And it's the same problem we're having today with viruses and a whole lot of things. We have debates on science that make no sense because they're basically fundamentally irrational.
Well, and science can lead you down. I mean, a lot of times, I know even going through school where it was sort of the evidence-based medicine was the standard to start to really only medicine really that was worthy of looking at. But part of the problem with that too is I understand the concept of it, but I think part of the problem is that you can be led down a lot of rabbit holes by just following, science too. I remember reading a book by Dr. Eric Rifkin called The Illusion of Certainty. And you'd probably really like it because it reminded me a lot of the book, Should I Get, what was the other one with, Should I Be Screened for Cancer? Or that book that talks about the different cancer screenings. And depending on how you look at numbers, you can kind of convince of anything. And so the numbers themselves, the way Dr. Eric Rifkin broke it down is it's particularly when they were switching from absolute risk to relative risk is what really confuses everything. And you can make anything look like it's dramatic in its effect or risk reduction. But in the reality, it's actually not that big of a deal for a lot of them.
Right. Yeah. Risk reduction is basically a crock, and that's why they use it, of course. And risk reduction just means if you have 1,000 people doing something like taking a drug for high blood pressure or preventing strokes, and in the group that takes the drug, let's say the group that takes the drug, one person has a heart attack or whatever measurement, and the 1,000 people who don't take the drug, 2 people. So 1 out of 1,000 who take the drug, 2 out of 1,000 who don't take the drug. So that's, I don't know how many decimal points, but 0.01% versus 0.02%. So any normal person would say that's a 0.01% reduction. And by the way, I'm not going to take that because that's not worth it. However, the medical profession will report that as a 33% reduction. Why? Because 1 + 2 is 3, and 2 is 66%, and 1 is 33%. So that's a 33% reduction. Therefore, it's a good intervention. And to make it even more sort of criminal and crazy, they report the side effects in absolute numbers.
Yeah.
So 10 versus 6, well, that's only 0.01%. Why, it's no big deal. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, the doctors don't know how to read this, and so they fall for it hook, line, and sinker. And that's why we have the healthcare situation we have now.
Yeah. And I'm glad. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Cowan.
Well, the other thing about evidence-based medicine, they have the old boys running who controls what is proper evidence. So they just perpetuate the same old thinking. And as an example of that, there's a concept in biology called pleomorphism, which has been visualized by many different people throughout the centuries, which is one bacteria will change forms and become a different form or a hyphal form, or then it will coalesce down into a bacteriophage, which is more like a viral form. And you can see these transformations happening. And it all depends on the condition that the organism is growing in. So if you're a diabetic, your life forms become more fungal. Now, in around 1890 or so, they decided that anybody who mentions pleomorphism cannot get it published in the medical literature. So therefore, there is no mention of pleomorphism, just by decree. And what's interesting, when you talk about pleomorphism, means that life forms are much more flexible and malleable than we think. And so then people say, so Tom, you mean elephants can become squirrels? And as far as I know, that's not true. But actually, though, sort of God did give us a boon here, and he made it so anybody with eyes to see can see that caterpillars actually do become butterflies. And now, if you ask a normal scientist, well, how does that's an example of pleomorphism, change in structure and form. And then you ask scientists, well, how does that happen? And you know what they say? They're genetically programmed. Now, first of all, that's a complete hypothesis, because nobody has ever seen or decoded the genetic program or the gene that makes a caterpillar into a butterfly. In fact, I would venture to say that's complete nonsense. But even if it was somehow associated with the genes, that's not an explanation, because somehow the genes must have been organized somehow in order to make that transformation happen. It doesn't just by kicking the can down the road, which is essentially what science is. We get smaller and smaller and smaller until there's nothing left. And then we say, well, we don't know how the mind came out of this atom anyways, because it doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we just say, it must be genetics. Which,
well, and a lot of stuff around the genetics has been really debunked in a lot of ways too. It makes me think of the work when even Dr. Bruce Lipton was looking at stem cells and putting them in different petri dishes, but changing the environment around them, and the same starting cell would turn into any other different cell depending on what the environment was that it was put in.
Right, that's pleomorphism.
Exactly. So
then
the
whole foundation of genetics actually has literally been disproven. And it's very relevant today because it has a lot to do with what people are about to get injected into their bodies. Because the central dogma of genetics is that so everything to do with living systems has to do with water and protein. Protein is the sort of scaffolding upon which the water is deposited and actually forms into crystals. So if you control the protein, you control the life. So that the central dogma is all the proteins are coded for by a gene. And the direction is a gene on a DNA makes RNA, makes protein. And the central dogma is it always goes in that direction, never the other way. Proteins don't code for genes. And we used to think RNA doesn't become DNA. And then we found that there's reverse transcriptase. So now we know RNA does become DNA, et cetera. So we now know that the central dogma is incorrect. But the other way we know is we did this human genome project and found about 10 to 20,000 genes and about 250,000 proteins, which means there's approximately 230,000 proteins which are not coded for by genes. And so the question is, how did they get there? And nobody knows. I mean, I think I know, but they don't know because they're stuck thinking it must be these genes. There's no other way for a protein to arise except by being coded for the gene. And that gets into another issue, which is, well, this happens in all of life now, but we're told something is true, or this is the way it is, and then the evidence directly contradicts that, right? We're told that all the proteins are made by genes. Then we go and run the numbers and we find out that can't possibly be true. And what happens? You would think that people would say, I don't believe that anymore. But that's not what happens. They say, that is what happens. We just don't understand how it happened. But we insist that that's the way it is. And if you say it isn't the way it is, we kick you off YouTube.
Yeah.
That's how science works now. Even though you can disprove it, that makes no difference because, you know, there's one of the main, discoveries or victories in modern science and medicine, modern biology, was the discovery of the sodium-potassium pump in the membrane, which regulates the osmotic balance of the cells. Now, the interesting thing about that is nobody has ever seen a pump in a membrane. In fact, I would say nobody has ever seen a lipid bilayer membrane, even though we all believe it. And believe it or not, there are currently 17 different models of what a lipid bilayer membrane is made of. There's the fluid mosaic model and the lipid bilayer, and there's 15 other ones. And as I like to point out, there's only one model of a Schnauzer dog. And that's because everybody, well, not everybody, but most of us have seen a Schnauzer dog. And if they say it looks like a cat, we would say, that's not a Schnauzer dog. We know what that looks like. But nobody has ever seen a lipid mosaic membrane. Nobody has ever seen a receptor embedded in a membrane, not once. When they say, well, you can't see it because the way we make the slides, it dissolves it. And so you say, well, where's the hole? There is no hole. And when you run the numbers and you figure out that in order for this pump to run, you would need about 30 times the energy that's available to the whole system, you start to realize there is no pump. It's just a myth. They made it up for a whole lot of reasons, which I won't get into, but it doesn't actually exist. There are no pumps. There are no actual receptors in cell membranes, even though I'd guess 60% of the drugs, like opiate receptors and serotonin receptors and all these different receptors crowded into these lipid bilayer membranes, none of which has ever been visualized or proven to exist. And so yet, even though you can actually use, make the energy diagram so you can prove that it can't possibly be true, we still believe it. And we still do medicine based on that model. And it doesn't seem to matter the reality, which I just think is curious, if nothing else.
Curious might be a gentle term for it sometimes. But what's the other theory then? What do you feel is going on with that then? How is that working?
So at the end of the day, and about what I'm about to say, I would hope, and I would actually rather that nobody believes anything I say at this point. Everybody should look into it. Now, I'll tell you the place to look into it. Anybody who wants to understand medicine or biology needs to be very familiar with the work of Gilbert Ling and Harold Hillman. They're easily find their works on the internet. They both wrote many books on, and they were both biologists, and they both died fairly recently. Harold Hillman, in particular, spent his career, 50 years, he was a British biologist, debunking cell biology. In other words, let's take something like a ribosome. Now, I'm sure you know what a ribosome is. It's a little organelle, it's called, in the cytoplasm of a cell. And the reason it's important is because that's the site of where the proteins are made, right? And so that's where the RNA is translated into protein. Now, do you know, so let's even go back a step. If I was to say, and I want to understand what your hand is made of and what your hand does, right? That's my quest. So here's how I'm going to do it. First, I'm going to cut your hand off your body. Then I'll put it in an enzyme bath to dissolve all the soft tissue. And then I'm going to freeze it at 150 degrees below 0 centigrade. And then I'm going to soak it in a heavy metal dye. And then I'm going to grind it up in a blender. And then I'm going to shoot an electron beam at it that immediately evaporates all the water. And then I'm going to look at it and I'm going to tell you what your hand does. You think I could do that?
Probably not very accurately.
Probably not. You have no, but that's every single ribosome, that's how it was seen. Now, interestingly, and everybody should check this, every single ribosome on an electron microscope picture is a perfect circle. Now, remember, this is a two-dimensional picture, right? So if it's a perfect circle, it must have been a sphere in real life. Now, remember that this cell was put into a blender in order to make it, in order to grind it up so you can stain it and see it. So imagine you have a sphere like an orange, right? Now, I put that in a blender. What are the chances that every piece that you get from that blended up orange is a perfect circle?
Mm-hmm.
You know what the chances
next
are?
to none.
0. In other words, the laws of spherical geometry tell you that that thing can't possibly exist like that. And that's the only way it's ever been seen. And so there's other proofs, and he wrote a whole sort of 200-page book on that and a few other things, demonstrating the entire history of the discovery of ribosomes and and how it was a sham. And so they don't exist. So the problem is then, where are the proteins made? Now, at the end of the day, I'll jump to the conclusion. If you do proper analysis of living tissue, the only thing you can prove exists are organized water in sort of blocks, like blocks of jello that are next to each other, that have a thin, something like a membrane between the blocks of jello. In that jello is dissolved proteins, lipids, minerals, and amino acids, few other things. There's a mitochondria in there, and there's a nucleus that probably has genetic material. And that's it. All the endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus and ribosomes and nuclear pores and lipid bilayer membranes and all the rest are artifacts of the way we examine tissue. And I don't remember your question, but so the relevance of that is that's the system of biology. Biology is the water is made coherent, meaning organized into a crystalline form through the various minerals, proteins, and fats that tissue contains. And then it acts like a receiver, like a radio receiver.
Mhm.
It accepts the influence of the sun and the light and the earth and human beings and plants, and organizes itself into a coherent structure. Now, as far as the sodium potassium thing, it turns out that the mesh of the crystal is so organized so it attaches to potassium and excludes sodium just by charge and size. So there's no pump needed, there's no energy needed. And the way it's organized is exactly the same way we make Jell-O. You have proteins and water, then nothing happens. You heat it, that unfolds the proteins, interacts with the water, cool it down, forms a gel. Now, the only difference is we have proteins that are folded, and they interact with ATP, which has nothing to do with energy, no matter how many books are written about that. But the ATP binds to the end of the proteins, unfolds it, attaches to the water, and creates the lens of your eye, which is based on a certain principle of being transparent to light. In your liver, you use different minerals, different lipids, different proteins to make a structure that's effective in detoxification, and so on. There's approximately 180 different tissues in the human being, eyes and ovaries, etc. 48 of them are what's called syncytia, which means they have no cells at all. They're like a lens of an eye. It's just a water crystal. And some of them have internal compartments, which are, I would say, erroneously called cells. And and that's how living systems are organized.
So then it sounds like that the heart of it, it's the quality or the state of the water that's playing a big role in how healthy the body's going to actually be, if it's able to do its job properly or not.
Yes, the health, and when you say health, what we really mean is the coherence of the water. If the water is disorganized, and you can see this in medicine, this is how I did medicine. So you have somebody with a normal joint, which means they have two essentially coherent crystals called bursa that are in the inside of the joint. All water crystals are negatively charged, so they repel each other, and because of the smooth surfaces, essentially you have a smooth motion of your knee. So, and they repel each other because of the negative charges. And then something happens to disturb the crystalline structure. Either there's not enough collagen, or an injury, or you put glyphosate in there, or electromagnetic fields that scramble the water, and the water loses its coherence and becomes liquid water. And that's what we call a joint effusion. And then this tissue breaks down because there's no protection, and then we call that osteoarthritis. That's not a disease. That's just a loss of the coherence of the water, leading to inevitable consequences, meaning your knee hurts. And you take another example, like I said, the lens of the eye, which is a perfect crystal with very little dissolved in it, because it's meant to be transparent to light. And you start disorganizing the crystal and making it harder, and so it becomes opaque to light, and that we call a cataract. And that is what we call the disease. And then we rip your eyeball out and put a new one in, which doesn't really work as well. And we call that medicine.
Well, and it shines a whole different light on the idea of aging. It's like aging is actually just a prolonged state of being in a out of coherent state with the water. So if you can get back into a coherent state with water, then the aging process dramatically changes, it sounds like. So I think then the question is, how do we actually optimize that coherent state of water within people so that we can maintain this sort of state of health that we call health?
I mean, the first thing is somebody needs to realize that that's what's happening, because modern science and medicine has no idea about this. I never heard in all my medical career one word about anybody saying, how's your water? What
Mhm.
kind of water do you drink? What actually impacts the coherence of the water? And most people have no idea about this. And if you have no idea, you won't be able to impact it. Now, the other thing I would say about this is we are at a very interesting time in humanity because there are essentially two competing visions of what life and a human being is meant to be. And the way I describe this is there's two essentially quintessential types of crystals in the world. One is made of water, that's biology, and the other is made of quartz. Now, the reason those are information processing systems is because they're both made in a holographic way, meaning every little piece of water crystal is reflected in the entire crystal as sort of as above, so below, as is quartz. So every little piece of a quartz crystal is reflected in the whole thing. And they have infinite surface areas. And so information is stored they're received by these surface areas. And there's infinite number in water, there's infinite number in a quartz crystal. And that's why quartz is the basis of computers, because you can download billions and trillions and whatever is more than trillions of bits of information. And so now there are people who are saying we should become quartz-based living systems. And so those are the competing vision. Now, the interesting thing about it is quartz is very stable. So it can last millions of years. So maybe that's a good idea. We should become quartz-based systems so then we can live 1,000,000 years. That's the whole point. But here's the problem. Quartz never changes the more information it downloads. It just adds more bits of information. Whereas every time a new impulse comes into your water-based system, it grows and evolves. So if you have a bad feeling, that changes your water crystal. If you put in glyphosate, if you put in good food, that changes your water crystal. So life is about growth, evolution, and transformation. And it's on the basis of a living water crystal that we grow and think and feel, and we actually become human beings. And what they're basically trying to do, that's what synthetic biology, that's what an mRNA so-called vaccine is to make living beings more like a quartz crystal. And I would say that's the end of free life in living systems, if that happens. So to get to your question, how do you do that? You know, you eat the Weston Price diet, you drink clean water, you learn how to make your water more coherent, you expose yourself to the natural energies that human beings evolved to accept, which means the sun and walking barefoot on the earth and playing in the ocean and holding hands and touching people and joining in singing groups, or there's a million different human activities. Those are all, what you're doing is collecting energy from the world to make your water more coherent. And if you want to make your water less coherent, then, you know, eat lousy food, eat poisons, breathe in poisonous air, spend all your time in front of a computer, and expose yourself to as much wireless frequencies as you possibly can. And I can guarantee you'll get sick.
Yeah, we listen to a lot of different information in different ways because I find the same thing. I mean, this is not the thing you're going to get the answers from the conventional science community. It's just not there. If anything, it's actually, I think, pulling you farther away from trying to understand this type of material. But I mean, in some spiritual contexts, people have heard this kind of stuff in different ways. Water is often used in ceremonies. It's a part of lots of different things. We were just listening to a episode by Dr. Jacqueline Hobbs, who goes by Oracle Girl, and she was actually just doing something about water specifically and incorporating even the concept of the fourth phase of water with that too, and how important it is to get back to a natural way of living, back in tune with literally with nature and what that means. And when we do that, for the most part, a lot of that just starts to unravel on its own. Things kind of take care of itself. It's not actually that complicated. It's just a matter of reconnecting back to our natural state.
Right. And here's the interesting thing. First of all, if you can picture that the coherence, and I mean the crystalline structure of water, which we know exists, it's like I was driving in the car about a year ago with a little friend who helps me with gardening. I mean, he's like 4 years old, and all of a sudden, we were listening to the radio, and there came an interview with me on the radio. So little friend says, he says, "Tom, how did you get into that radio?" and that's essentially the point of view of modern science. They think that your thoughts are generated out of the chemicals of your brain, of which there's no evidence for that at all. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because I would say, I used to think there was 3 things that made us sick, which number 1, injuries, number 2, starvation, which means bad food, and number 3, poisons. But I've come to appreciate it, particularly in this last year, that there's a 4th way that's probably even more important than any of those. And I'm not sure what the word for it, but I'll use the word delusional, which means you have bad thinking, or you think nonsense. And so the interesting thing is your brain, which maybe has something to do with thinking, at least we think it does. Our brain thinks it's the brain that has something to do with thinking. So anyway, I would say that's an open book, but the brain is 80% water instead of 70% like the rest of us, because essentially the brain is like the radio, and the thoughts are like the sound that comes from the radio station or the interview with me, and the radio turns that into coherent music or words. And that's why the organ that has to do that processing, the brain, is the highest in water. Now, here you have all these people who have delusional ideas, like viruses make them sick, for instance. And here's the interesting thing. When you tell them the rational case that can't possibly be true, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So what I've decided is the problem is not that I'm not clear enough in my quote argument, but their brain is messed up and they can't think like that. So now I've decided that it's much better, if you want to change your consciousness, meaning how you think and the way you see the world, don't bother like thinking different things, because it won't work, or reading different arguments, because it won't work. You should change the coherence of your brain. And then, like magic, suddenly you say, "Oh yeah, I could see it all along. These viruses don't make you sick. I don't know why I couldn't see that before." And the reason is because you were essentially walking through mud, and so you couldn't see it because literally you couldn't see it. And there's no words. It's like my son said when I was talking to the BBC, who were saying what an idiot I am. And he said, you have to remember, there's no combination of words that will get them to think differently. Yeah. You could spend all night trying to think, what about if I said this combination? And the reason is because their radio is out of tune. They don't hear the music.
Tom, I literally had my wife and I had this conversation just last night. We were talking about the same thing. And again, same idea. It's like there's no sort of it's sort of like there's never convincing much of anything unless someone's already in alignment with that way of thinking or in resonance with it. And I mean, how we kind of think about it is sort of like states of consciousness. So it's like the only way you're going to allow something more into your box is if you move to a different state of consciousness that's going to expand the box to allow different information in. And then when it does, I think of it like, moving up a mountain, all of a sudden your vista naturally changes and you move into a higher part of the mountain, you see more of the surrounding. So it's sort of like you're not trying to make yourself or convince yourself of anything. You just naturally see things differently.
It also helps to get rid of some of the old garbage.
Right. Well, I think a lot of times that's what anchors us down, that stops us from being able to move to these different states. So it's a whole process, of I think dissolving some of that stuff that does keep us as an anchor down, that doesn't allow us to actually even see anything different. But when you were talking about wrong thinking, it's like a lot of the work with even like Dr. Amit Goswami, and he'll say the same thing. They'll look at it as sort of a system that looks like like a triangle, as far as the more abstract is at the top and the more concrete is down at the bottom. So you kind of move from like, the sort of spiritual body and the archetype, and then you get the mental and the vital and then the physical. And so they would say, talking to him, he would say wrong thinking is one of the primary problems that create ill health, because wrong thinking then creates a certain feeling state which affects the vital body. And they would talk about that being almost like the morphogenic field. If the vital body is out of balance, then that's what continually is the blueprint for the cell. And so when you're in certain emotional states that are constantly influencing the blueprint for the cell, then you just keep creating more or less this. It's like the terrain is always staying a certain way from that emotional state. And so then you just keep creating the same sort of cell structure on the physical level over and over and over again.
Except the only difference is I would be careful about using the word cell.
Correct, yeah.
You don't actually know that the cell is not the basic building block of biology.
So probably it creates a discoherence then.
Right. And here's the thing, if you get into, and this is a very practical thing. So what keeps people from discarding old thinking patterns which were wrong and then moving up the mountain to a new vista? That's the question. And mostly it's like somewhere like embarrassment, or, well, that's the way I always used to think, so that's the way I'm still going to think. And I decided a while ago that I couldn't do that because it was standing in my way. And the upshot of that is, when I look back at, so you mentioned this is the 6th book I've written. Every single one of those 6 books, there's so many things I got wrong in there that some of them are actually embarrassing to me. And most people, I think, would not like to say things like that, because then maybe they won't buy my book, because anyways, they got it wrong. But what I decided is, it wasn't like I was trying to deceive anybody. That was my best understanding at the time. And here's the other thing. Every single mistake I made, and there was a bunch of them, maybe even a lot of them, had one cause, and that's because I believed the dominant narrative too much. And even a lot of times I had this thing in me that said, Tom, I don't think that's quite right, but everybody believes it, so let's not fight this one right now, or I'm not even going to look into this. So I would say things like, there was people with chickenpox or something, and they found the virus in them. Turns out that it's never happened. And at the time, if you say, well, why did I write that? Like, why did I think that at the time? And I don't really know, except I've been told that for 40 years. And so must be true. Even me, like, I don't mean like I'm some genius here. I just spent my whole career not saying the heart isn't a pump and genes don't have anything to do with cancer. You would think I would be hip to that stuff, but it keeps coming in, like, the proteins are made in the ribosomes. I never thought about, did anybody actually prove that ribosomes exist? And then when I went back and read Hillman and found the step-by-step dissection of that theory, you start realizing that every mistake is from essentially trusting a narrative which you don't even know where it came from. And it's so playing out now, because if you go around, the population who's scared to death of coronavirus and locking the whole world down, putting everybody in prison, and you say, give me the evidence that a coronavirus exists. 99% of the people, they have no idea. If you say, how would you go about showing that, right? I know you don't know how they did it, but how would you go? Like if I said, show me that pigs exist, you would say, well, I would go to a farm and I'd see, and there's a pig, and that's how human beings say that pigs exist. They don't know how you do that with a virus, which means they can't possibly evaluate whether anybody did it or not, because they don't even know that you should go to a farm and look, because they never heard of that. And yet they are willing to die based on that belief, of which they have no clue where they got there. And that's a delusional society.
So where do you start then, Tom, where do you start with the breakdown of that then? Because I mean, it really is like a lot of ingrained in doctrine sort of patterns and beliefs and whatnot that have been accumulating that then, basically creates our world of what we believe to be true. And a question I ask a lot of people is how do you begin the process of really discerning truth from falsehood and pulling that apart? How do you start that process? Like, I mean, a lot of times I don't think people even know where to even look to start the unraveling process of these sort of beliefs and truths that we've taken on that may not be quite so true.
I mean, it's a good question, and I don't know that I have an answer for that. But I can tell you that the main reason how this came about historically, fundamentally, is human beings got convinced that their direct perception was not trustable.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's in contrast, to traditional people. So you can give an example of most native people would say things like they could talk to trees,
Yeah.
right? Maybe talking is the wrong word. Let's say communicate with trees.
Yeah.
And then the white people would come and they'd say, what's up? Well, I'm communicating with the trees, and they say we should, leave the deer alone. And the white person would say, I don't hear anything from the trees. So they say, okay, I'm going to try. So they go to the tree. Meanwhile, you got to think about this. These same people and their friends and cohorts, they basically massacred a bunch of forests. So they'll listen for maybe a half an hour, standing next to a tree, and they say, I don't hear anything. Trees don't communicate. So number one, I would say, first of all, if I was a tree, I wouldn't talk to you either, because you're basically massacring my friends and family members. Second of all, what do you think that the trees speak English? Like they communicate in a different way. And you have to train yourself to listen. And you have to realize that you become the arbitrator of what's true. But just like you can't go to the New York Philharmonic and say, I want to play first oboe. I don't know if there is a first oboe, but let's say there is. And the guy says, fine, are you any good at playing oboe? No, I've never played an oboe before. Do you have an oboe? No. What makes you think that we should let you play first oboe? Well, because I want to. I mean, you might want to go and A, buy an oboe, 2, practice for 20 years and take some lessons. We're so, is somewhere between foolish and arrogant to think, I want to, therefore I should play first oboe. or I should be able to talk to trees because I say. And so what happens then is, because you haven't actually started with, I'm going to believe my own eyes, ears, and senses. If you start with that and then train yourself, you have to, if you don't believe it, you won't train yourself. Then you spend your whole life, like I would say I have done. I just decided, more or less, I'm not going to believe anybody because mostly they're wrong. So I'm going to train myself to see. And then you ask for help, you get input, you talk to your angel, you just do whatever you can to sort of get input. But it always comes back to, I'm not believing anything. See, the native people, they didn't believe trees could talk.
Yeah, they knew it.
Any more than you believe you're sitting on a chair,
Mhm.
right? You don't believe you're sitting on a chair. You're sitting on a chair because you know you're sitting on a chair. And
Yeah.
they could communicate with trees because the trees said, you better kick these people out because they're going to massacre all the deer. And so they said, right, that's correct. So we hear you.
Yeah.
Once you believe in that system, or once, it's not a belief, that's the wrong word. Once you practice that, you will find amazing things happen in your life. But we are systematically schooled and taught that is not what humanity does. That's not normal. There must be something wrong with you. There's an editorial in the New York Times. You should not think about any of this, just believe the experts.
Yeah.
So that's where we are. We don't know anything. We just believe whatever nefarious reasons they want to tell us whatever thing. And then they confuse the hell out of you deliberately. They tell you, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, wear 2 masks, wear 6 masks. Doesn't work, it does work. And then everybody says, I don't know what to believe, I'll just believe him.
Well, and that's what happens when people get overwhelmed or confused, and they hand over their sovereignty to an authority figure. It seems to be what goes on. And everything you talked about has been one of the central themes that has run through this entire series, is the importance of really, however you want to talk about it, but it's reconnecting to that inner knowing within each person, and that in some ways that's been very disconnected. And it's why I think people get so confused, because they've actually been taught in many ways to not trust what their own gut
Deliberate.
instincts and their heart wisdom often tells them. And
it's very deliberate, believe me.
Yeah, and
you can
sorry, go
see
ahead.
the way they do it, and the confusing messages, and the complexity of the minutia. It's all based, and the competition, it's all based on getting you to disconnect.
Yeah. So one of the things that I know we've done that has been probably the most helpful is, I mean, it's as tricky as this because everybody's lives are kind of plugged into that entire system. Even the hours that people spend working and all of these things, it's hard to kind of pull yourself away from it. But it's like, the more you can start to, at least for us, disconnect from things like mainstream media, all of that stuff, try and get out in nature as much as you can. I find nature is the thing that often, if I ask myself a question, say there's a big decision that we're having to make around something, and if I'm asking that to myself when I'm in a bit of a stressed state, then we know that's not the best time to listen and take advice from ourselves when we're in that state. So if we go out, spend some time in nature, reconnect a little bit, naturally kind of slow things down, and then all of a sudden ask yourself again, and the answer is usually very different. So part of it in my mind is like, the more you can literally get out in nature, it's different. Like you will naturally start to see the world a little bit different when you do connect back to that natural state. And when you were talking about with the indigenous cultures and sort of this knowing around things, it is so much to me what I see happening with kids right now too. I've got a 3 and a 4-year-old, and so my 3 and 4-year-old, they do talk to trees. We've got a forest right out here, so we go walking out there, and they'll go over, they'll hug a tree, they'll like pet the tree, they'll have a conversation with it. And it's like, and I, not for 1 second do you ever think that they are not, that they're actually connected. And so to sort of encourage that and actually build a conversation conversation around it actually makes it a lot more fun, and it opens us up to see, I think, what the possibilities are when we see it from like early on like that, we see what they innately do rather than trying to teach them what they're doing is wrong.
Except I wouldn't even encourage it.
Just let it happen, unfold naturally.
In fact, the worst thing you can do with a child is try to teach them anything. So you should just let them alone. And if they say anything to you, you can give them a clear answer, like even if you don't know. But most children, if you say, "Oh, good, you can talk to trees," their natural instinct is, "I'm not talking to you anymore."
Right.
So I wouldn't even do that. And if they'll tell you about it, as long as if you're just interested in what their experience is, whatever it is, they'll tell you. But if you try to encourage it, that's an intrusion on their freedom.
Yeah. Well, and when I use the word encourage, it would be more meaning like we create the availability to have access to it as much as possible. Right. Yeah. So it's sort of like let them do what they're going to do, but at least at that age, it's where we can assist with it is to create an opportunity for that type of engagement.
Right, because there could be children that don't want to communicate with trees.
Yeah,
and that's fine. And if you try to game the system like a good person communicates with trees.
Yeah, you're doing the same thing.
Any self-respecting child will teach you a good lesson.
They definitely do, and very quickly, if you're open to hearing it.
Whether you're open or not, they'll still teach
you. Yeah.
They'll make your life miserable if you're not open to it.
Yeah, that's for sure. I know we're running up on time here, Dr. Cowan. One thing I maybe would like to just ask in the final bit here is, and we've kind of talked about some of this right now, but as far as take-home steps that would be things that people could start to implement right now, what would be some of the things that would be probably some of the more important things for people to do? And I know that some of this is only going to land if this resonates with people, but if they are, and they're open to certain things and they're sort of ready, what would be some of the things that people could start doing now to get back on that right track?
Just start cleaning, ask different questions, clean up your water, and get out into the woods.
I think that is heat advice for crazy times right at the moment for sure. So, all right, Tom, where can we send people to learn more about the work that you're doing?
The main website is drtomcowan.com. And I want to put in a plug for, we have a new sort of community network called Subscribestar. And I think somewhere on the website you can find that. And that's where we post different interviews and question and answer and live sessions. So I really want to encourage everybody to join us on that. And we have a lot of exciting plans for what we can do with that community. So
wonderful.
drtomcowan.com, Subscribestar.
Okay, I'll put the links for all of those, and I'll find the link specifically for the Subscribestar as well. So we'll put that into the show notes there for people to check that out. And did we cover everything there as much as we could? Is there any last thoughts you want to share?
I think it's good.
I think we covered lots there.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your program here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.